welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and to this lecture by Susan Schwab. In terms of her background, she has a BA from Williams, a master's from Stanford, and a PhD from George Washington University. And Susan and I were just talking, and Susan's roots in Asia go back quite a ways, so to speak. So anyway, look, we're very fortunate to have Susan here to speak. In terms of the arrangements, Susan will talk for maybe around 30 minutes or so, following which we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. And she's indicated that this is the part of the talk she likes most, the chance, the opportunity to respond to particular questions. Could I ask that when we do get to the Q&A part, that when you ask a question, number one, you speak into the microphone, and number two, you give your name and your affiliation. But look, thank you very much, Susan, for being here, and we'll hear about U.S. trade policy and politics vis-à-vis Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am not going to have PowerPoint. I am not going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation today. I am going to try to be as informal as possible in my presentation and hope that you will engage in the dialogue with me after my formal introductory remarks. I want to make sure that I'm able to talk about the issues that are of most interest to you, and I recognize a couple folks in the audience who know as much about American trade policy and politics as I do. So I'm going to be careful not to go on at too much length. As Professor Adams indicated, for me it's great fun to be back in Singapore. My roots in Asia, I am in many ways a sort of a child of Asia. I first came to Singapore in 1972. I graduated from the International School of Bangkok. I worked in Japan and worked in China. And so this is a region of the world where I always enjoy coming back, and every time you return to Asia, something is different. I mean, I used to marvel when I worked for Motorola in China. There was a one-block walk that I used to take every day between where I was living and our office. And in that one block, every month, you could tell there was something else going on. There was some new business popping up. Some entrepreneur had added a phone, and then he added a refrigeration unit, and then he added a restaurant, and you could see it on a week-by-week basis. And for one who was originally trained in development policy, development economics, it is great to see that there is indeed transition, takeoff, and all these things that I learned as theories. Great to see them in practice. I'm going to talk about a couple of things this afternoon related to American trade policy and politics vis-à-vis Asia. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Obama administration, some observations about the administration that you may or may not know that may or may not be relevant to their trade policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the trade politics that they are dealing with. We have an unusual system. Are they protectionist? Are they not protectionist? I'd like to get beyond some of the headlines and the rhetoric. And then I'd like to talk about what the implications are in terms of global trade policies, practices, and what we're looking at going forward in terms of regional economic integration, in terms of multilateral trade negotiations, and so on. And so those are sort of the three areas that I'm going to touch on, and I'd be happy to talk about any topic related to trade policy, trade politics that you might want to address. Let me begin, as President Obama is about to arrive in Asia, and note that I think it's safe to say that this administration has a strong appreciation for Asia. It is somewhat theoretical, as distinct from reflecting experience on the ground. But if there were ever a U.S. administration that is comfortable in a multicultural, multipolar environment, it is certainly this administration. They are thinking through the role, the appropriate role for the United States, for their administration, in terms of responsibilities, in terms of obligations. They are having to come to grips with the fact that there are many countries that are happier in a multipolar rather than unipolar or bipolar geopolitical environment, but there are many fewer countries ready to step up and assume the leadership roles and responsibilities that come with being at the high table, and so that they have not yet come to grips with, and quite frankly, the emerging markets and others haven't come to grips with that either. Europe, arguably, has never come to grips with that notion of what does leadership really mean in the global context. This is an administration that is theoretically pro-trade and hasn't figured out how yet to implement that as a policy. The president, his senior team, these are really smart people, really smart, well-meaning people. Interestingly, unlike any administration in contemporary history that I can think of, there is no private sector expertise at the cabinet level and sort of immediate sub-cabinet level. There is less experience in the private sector. We have an interesting system, as I suspect most of you know, that sets the U.S. government structure apart from a lot of other governments, in that we have this constant churn of individuals who move between the public sector, the private sector, frequently the nonprofit sector, and move in and out at some points at very, very high levels of government, and come to work with the career civil service and foreign service personnel, and it has the advantage of bringing in new blood on a regular basis. Sometimes it has the disadvantage of a lack of continuity. And so this administration has come in. There are many people in this administration with a lot of experience, but very few of them are coming in from the private sector. And I think that certainly in the near term is hobbling them somewhat. They do appreciate the importance of trade to the U.S. economy. You need to look no further than Friday's statement that the president made after the unemployment rate came out, 10.2% unemployment. One of the things he talked about was exports. What they clearly have not decided yet, again, is how to build a comprehensive, cohesive trade policy that capitalizes on, reflects that almost theoretical interest. Now, they've articulated their position in terms of, quote, enforcement, that element of their trade policy, and that's perfectly natural, and any country that negotiates trade agreements needs to be able to show their stakeholders, their businesses, their agricultural constituencies that agreements will be enforced. And I think that is one of the strengths of the multilateral trading system, the GATT and now the WTO. But a an enforcement-only trade policy is not a trade policy. And so, yes, the administration has had a great deal on their minds, a great deal that they have had to deal with when it comes to economic policy. But for a variety of reasons that I will get into a little bit later, I think if they had their druthers, they'd sort of like trade policy to go away, at least go away for a while, because it is represents a difficult set of issues for them to come to grips with, for the very simple reason that they haven't figured out how to reconcile campaign rhetoric, campaign commitments with governing, and with the obligations, responsibilities that come with being a major trading country in a global economic environment. They are dealing with the fact that one of the core constituencies of their political base, organized labor unions, and labor unions in the United States, unlike, I might add, many other governments, labor governments, organized labor unions in the United States, have become unalterably opposed to trade liberalizing agreements of any form. So the administration faces a dilemma in that their party, and in particular, their party, Democratic Party, that has control of the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, and the United States Senate, there is a very clear split within the party on trade policy. Now, I should note, this is not to imply that the Democratic Party in the United States is, quote, protectionist. There is a real split. I mean, there are individuals in the party, groups in the party that clearly would like to see more economic isolation, that trend in that direction. There are also individuals and groups in the Democratic Party that are as pro-trade liberalization as anyone you would have found in the Bush administration, quite frankly. But it is a dilemma for the party in power to know that this is an issue that is likely to split their caucus, to split their constituencies. And it was one of the reasons, quite frankly, that the congressional leadership, the Democratic leadership in the House in particular, during the Bush administration refused to move several of the bilateral free trade agreements that we had negotiated, even though the votes were there. I mean, we were quite certain that if the agreements had been brought up for a vote in the House of Representatives, they probably would have passed. But they would have passed with a split within the Democratic Party, and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, did not want to have that happen, did not want her members to have to deal with that kind of a difficult vote. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, it is in fact the United States Congress that has the power to regulate foreign commerce. And so all of the authorities that the President of the United States, that the executive branch has in international trade, in trade policy, is in fact delegated by the Congress. And the way it has worked historically, those laws associated with the enforcement side of the equation, those are permanently delegated and periodically amended by the Congress, but those laws associated with trade liberalizing agreements, Congress has, those authorities associated with trade liberalizing agreements, Congress has kept to itself and only delegates periodically to the executive branch under very specific circumstances. Now, the good news is that the last time the Congress tried to write trade policy or do its own, quote, trade agreements was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, and it was a total disaster. They raised 20,000 different tariffs and prolonged and deepened the Great Depression. And that was the last time Congress went about trying to write, their own trade policy. And starting in 1934, the Congress started periodically to delegate to the president the authority to negotiate and implement trade liberalizing agreements. U.S. trade law and U.S. trade policy, therefore, if you look at it over a period of history, seems to fit a pattern, to sort of, we're in an academic environment, X minus Y plus Z. Think of it as an equation where X is the authority to implement trade liberalizing agreements, minus Y are the limits that the Congress puts on the use of that authority, such as you can't cut tariffs more than 50%, or certain sensitive products are walled off. Plus Z is everything else the Congress makes the president sign to get X minus Y, trade adjustment assistance or that kind of thing. So it is a bargain, it is a negotiation, and when you are the U.S. trade representative, your time is sort of equally divided between negotiating with the Congress, negotiating with other parts of the administration, of the government, because you are working with the State Department and the Treasury Department and the Agriculture Department and the Commerce Department and so on. And occasionally you actually get to sit down and negotiate with your international counterparts. And those negotiations are often more interesting and more fun and far less tedious than the negotiations that you conduct with the folks at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, given that we have a de facto pause in U.S. trade policy, should we be worried? And I would say no, not yet. The question is, how long will this policy gap persist? The nice thing about an event like the Apec Summit, or indeed any summit, whether it's Apec Summit, whether it's the G20 meeting, these are all action-forcing events. When you are in the White House, when you are in the executive office of the president, there are so many things coming at you at any given point in time. And this is particularly true of this administration, which walked in the door in the middle of an economic crisis, 2 wars going on. They have a few things on their minds, on their hands, and need time to sort of settle in and figure out what their priorities are going to be and how they're going to execute them. An event like the Apec Summit, though, focuses the mind, and you can bet that in the last couple weeks there have been discussions, and I say this from the outside, not having any inside information, but you can bet that there have been extensive discussions going on within the interagency process, presumably with the president in advance of the bilaterals and the APEC meetings taking place here, about regional economic integration. Obviously, one of the topics that comes up at APEC, whether it is a potential FTAP, free trade area of the Asia-Pacific region, whether it is ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6, East Asia economic integration with the United States on the inside or with the United States on the outside, and that obviously is a topic that is and certainly should be of a great deal of concern to this administration. I know it is of a great deal of concern to the business community. I'm sure there have been discussions of the Doha round. Periodically, the president, Larry Summers, others talk about their interest in the Doha round. The question is, at what point will that interest manifest itself in some kind of specific action and policy initiatives? Similarly, we have meetings and a visit coming up to Korea. Certainly, there must be some awkwardness for the president, for the administration, when they encounter their Korean counterparts with the Chorus FTA Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement that was concluded, 3 years ago, still sitting there waiting to be enacted into law by the United States Congress. And then, of course, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was the P4, for those of you who follow trade policy, a free trade agreement where Singapore, one of the countries in the lead, Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, and Brunei, that the United States indicated we wanted to get engaged in the negotiation. Other countries have since indicated their interest. It's been nicknamed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it is a concept where the new U.S. administration has to decide, is this something that they want to make their own? Because it was, roughly outlined. There was very, very little detail, and that was in part to enable the new administration to decide to make it their own in whatever form and in whatever approach they wish to do so. Now, if you read the press, you would think that there is a trade war going on between the United States and China, or at least it's imminent. And periodically you would be told that the Obama administration is protectionist, so quote unquote. I don't happen to think that is the case. I think the jury's out in terms of the direction they will go. Unfortunately, lacking a proactive trade strategy and trade liberalizing agenda, the more, picking my words carefully, pernicious congressional, now I'm going to be a little more diplomatic than that. There has, unfortunately, in the absence of a strong proactive pro-trade leadership on the part of the White House, been enacted several pieces of legislation that can only be described as economic isolationist in nature. The one that is best known is the quote "Buy America," Hire America language that was in the original stimulus package. The fact that it is relatively minor and arguably fully consistent with U.S. WTO obligations is largely irrelevant. The handful of jobs the legislation might have protected have been more than offset by jobs lost by virtue of all the copycat, buy national, buy local initiatives that other countries have undertaken because they've been able to point to the U.S. Buy America laws as an excuse to do what they probably would have done anyway, but as an excuse to do that kind of buy national policy. A provision related to Mexican trucking we can get into if you have any interest. And most recently, and in this case, an item where the administration had discretion, the Chinese tire case. And I'd be happy to talk more about that case if you are interested when we get into a discussion, because one can, I could argue it was the right thing to do or it was the wrong thing to do. What it really comes down to is, was it a one-time event or is it the beginning of a series? And the difference, the way you answer that question will tell you how good, how bad or how benign the action was. The most recent event, and I was asked about this morning on CNBC, had to do with a steel pipe and tube anti-dumping, countervailing duty decision. And I would just say parenthetically on that, U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty law really has virtually no discretion associated with it at all. The Commerce Department looks for margins, evidence of subsidies. The International Trade Commission, which is an independent body looks for evidence of injury, and then the anti-dumping duties or the countervailing duties are imposed automatically. The executive, there is no executive discretion per se. And again, we can have a conversation about non-market economy status. That is a policy area. But when you look at anti-dumping and countervailing duty actions, the single largest user of that kind of statute in the world is India, followed very closely by China. And U.S. use of anti-dumping and countervailing duty law actions are in single digits relative to the multiple use by China, by India, by the EU, and I would add much in a context, a legislative context that's much less transparent than the U.S. Version. Now, the fact that up to this point the administration has not done anything that is truly damaging to U.S. trade policy, to U.S. commerce, to the global trading system, doesn't mean that one shouldn't be concerned about a potential, trend line. What we have seen up to this point is the beginning of many more, or is this sort of a near-term phenomenon with an administration that has just come into office in the middle of a major recession? What I do think is evident is that trade is sort of the elephant in the living room when it comes to the Obama administration. The Obama administration came in with a great deal in the way of positive expectations on the part of other countries. Polling data, both within and outside the United States, was very positive. The one area where there were questions was trade, and that was because of the campaign. And up to this point, and recognize this is still a very new administration, the administration has done nothing to allay the fears of the international community related to their trade policy. The other thing that is evident is that when the U.S. is not leading in a pro-trade market liberalizing direction, no one else does either. And that is something we can have all sorts of wonderful theoretical conversations about multipolar worlds and how very important and I would say gratifying it is that we have countries that developed and developing countries sitting at the table together in the Doha round trying to negotiate trade deals. But it turns out that being at the table, being in the inner circle doesn't necessarily equate with exercising leadership and representing more than just your national interest when you're at the table, which is something that has certainly been lacking in Geneva, and it is unfortunate that China, India, Brazil have not been able to step up in a way to lead by example. And all you have to do, and I'm going to close out with a couple of G20 statistics, and then let's have a conversation about any of the areas that I've touched on where you may have a particular interest. But when the G20 first met in November of 2008, they pledged, the members pledged, and this is at the leader level, that they were not going to do things protectionist. They were not going to take protectionist actions. By April, Global Trade Alert reported that 17 out of the 20 G20 members had in fact taken protectionist actions, a total of 47 actions. And I believe the reason the number was 17 out of 20 is they didn't have data on the other 3. And I think that it's quite certain that if they had data on the other 3, it would have been 20 out of 20. By the time we got to September, the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, there were 190 measures that had been taken, so measures at an accelerated pace. Global Trade Alert reported that there were 134 more in the pipeline. And of those, only 25 of them fit into the category of using WTO consistent safeguard mechanisms, whether it's the escape clause, whether it's anti-dumping or countervailing duty actions. Those were the minority, and the vast majority of these actions came in the area of import licensing or SPS, sanitary, phytosanitary restrictions or subsidies. And every one of the 20 of the G20 are sinners in this regard. And the reason this data exists is because the purpose was to come up with sort of a name and shame approach, and so I'm about to do a little naming and shaming. Top of our list of sinners is the EU, starting interestingly enough with Germany, but in total number of actions taken. In terms of one single country, the country that took the most actions by far was Russia, who Russia not even being a member of the WTO, and perhaps that is part of what accounts for it. But Russia took 19 actions. India and Indonesia took 10 each. China took 8. The U.S. took 7. However, when you look at a different slice of the same data, you discover that China's actions have hit more countries than any other single country in the world, affecting, by GTA's count, 164 countries. China has also been hit by more actions by other countries than any other country, and in that case, 100 actions. The U.S. actions have impacted 120 countries, and the U.S. has been hit by 86 actions. Now, what this data tells us is how, one, incredibly self-defeating trade protectionism is. And even though, and it is interesting to note, the WTO, for all of its faults and controversy, really has created a ceiling for protectionism in this economic crisis. When you look at these 190 actions, virtually all of them fall within a definition that is arguably WTO consistent. That doesn't mean they're good, but it does mean they are not to the extreme that they would have been or could have been absent this kind of multilateral agreement. Now, one of the disturbing elements, and again having to do with emerging markets, because over the years and multiple rounds of GATT negotiations, and ultimately with the creation of the WTO, the U.S. and the EU sort of used to go off in a corner and decide what the deal was going to look like and impose it on all the developed countries, and the developing countries pretty much got a free ride. That means that there are developing countries with very significant nominal tariff rates, bound tariff rates, very, very high. And even though they may have quite low applied tariffs, that room between the applied and the bound rates, it is fully WTO consistent for those countries to ratchet up their duties from 5% applied to over 100% bound rates, or in the case of a country like India, there are many, many tariff lines that aren't bound at all, and therefore it is perfectly WTO consistent for India to raise a lot of tariffs. And generally, when the emerging markets are raising their tariffs or imposing their barriers, and they have a lot of room to do it, it is other emerging markets and other developing countries that are being damaged the most by those actions. The other thing that we learn from this exercise is that in the absence of leadership, and I should note Singapore in many cases is the exception to this, because Singapore has shown us all and reminds us all that no country has ever achieved or sustained prosperity using trade protectionism, and that in fact countries that have liberalized their markets, that have opened their trade, removed their trade barriers, you look in the 1990s, they grew 3 times faster than countries that did not do that. But if, as we have seen, every major trading country in the world virtually has taken these negative actions, there is no country out there that can stand up and say, wait a minute, you know, this is a negative spiral, this really corrosive erosion, even though it is not having a huge impact on commercial flows, is clearly movement in the wrong direction and can continue to have this corrosive effect in the international trading system, while at the same time there is very little going on in a multilateral trade liberalizing direction. So I am going to stop there in terms of my monologue, my soliloquy, and suggest that while we have over half of the world's GDP represented here in Singapore this week, and close to 70% of global trade represented in Singapore this week, that there probably are a few questions or comments that you might have, and I will do my best to respond. It's going to be a very interesting week, and I'm very, very pleased to be here at the Lee Kuan Yew School to share it with you. So thank you.
That announced that the United States was going to enter into the talks in September of 2008. And what interests me is, first of all, why does the United States want to join the TPP? But secondly, I find the timing a little odd. Why September of 2008, as your administration was coming to the end? It seemed like, especially since the TPP could have been entered into at any point after 2006. So I'm wondering why 2008 September? And then what was the United States thinking when it announced that it wanted to join?
Sure. No, good, very, very good question. I can tell you what the last administration was thinking, and I can't tell you what this administration is thinking. As the discussions of a potential FTAP, free trade area of the Asia Pacific, moved through various Apec meetings, it became fairly clear that there was a level of discomfort among various Apec members about this prospect. And you can, you know, it shows up in Apec announcements every year as a, quote, long-term goal, but the thought of an Asia-Pacific free trade agreement that includes both China and the United States, that includes China and Taiwan, you can, you know, just sort of think about the logistics and the politics of negotiating this. There are multiple ways of negotiating such or pursuing that kind of regional economic integration. You can start from scratch. You know, you can start with a clean sheet of paper. you can take this noodle bowl of bilateral and regional deals and try to figure out how to knit them together, which generally involves rules of origin, which are sort of the ultimate nightmare of trade agreements. Or you can take an existing agreement and start building concentric circles around it. And the P4, when we looked at the first of all, we had a series of bilateral agreements either in place or being negotiated in the region. The FTA with Australia, the FTA with Singapore, obviously, and the FTA with South Korea. But when you look at the regional deals, the one that came closest to the sort of gold standard free trade agreement that the United States had been negotiating was the P4. And so 2 years in advance of that September 2008 announcement, 2 years, a year and a half, somebody would have to correct me on the date, we announced that we were going to have exploratory talks with the P4 in terms of the potential for joining. And it was after looking at the various options, going through the our interagency process, consulting with the Hill. I mean, we have, as you know, very, very detailed consultation requirements, in part associated with this Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. We concluded that we wanted to participate, but knew that with a new administration coming in, we needed to make sure the announcement was sufficiently robust as to propel a discussion, but not to imply that we were tying the new administration's hands in terms of a deal, which was why the first round of negotiations of the TPP was scheduled for March of 2009. It was a conscious decision not even to have the first round during our watch, because it really had to be a decision of the new administration as to whether or not they wanted to pursue the TPP and what they wanted it to look like. So what we were trying to do was to say, this is a good idea. This is a conversation we've been having for almost 2 years with in particular, well, actually with all 4 of the TPP members, and we were hoping the next administration would pick up and make it their own. They haven't decided yet, but that's really why, why the announcement was made when it was made, and why the first round of negotiations wasn't scheduled until after we left office, to leave it to them.
We had a question here and then here.
I'm Suparna Karmakar from Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. I would seek your comments and views on 2 issues. One is, it's often said that the developing countries have been getting WTO rounds for free. In the last round of negotiations, when the developing countries did negotiate, I would think that the trade-off was for the developing countries to yield on services and intellectual property rights. So there was not really any pressure on them to cut tariffs.
You're talking about Uruguay? You're talking about
in the Uruguay round.
Yep.
So, I mean, rather than saying that they got things for free, maybe we should say that the negotiations were not a tariff cut for tariff cut.
It was an asymmetrical.
It was a different kind. So if there exists some tariff waters today, it needs to be sort of represented in a different manner rather than, pointing an implicating finger. The second thing was about the U.S. anti-dumping law. It is non-transparent. I mean, it is transparent and all that, I agree. But there has been a WTO inconsistent finger being pointed vis-a-vis zeroing.
That's right.
So what would you think? I mean, and the U.S. administration hasn't been moving either in the previous government, and we don't know what this government is going to do. Right. So what do you think? And they have been thinking, why this, this blatant violation, and what, now that you're out of the government, what you honestly think should be done?
Zeroing is one of these excruciatingly painful, technical, anti-dumping law provisions or elements that sort of was the bane of my existence at Doha round meetings. And I obviously can't prejudge what this administration will do. Zeroing just has to do with how you calculate dumping margins. And the U.S. has been found consistently, the U.S. implementation of this zeroing provision has been found consistently inconsistent with the WTO, with U.S. WTO obligations. And I think it's safe to say that the last administration, and presumably this administration, isn't going to give it up easily. But why give anything up when there's a negotiation going on? And there will be, if the negotiators, Doha round negotiators, ever get beyond the original, quote, modalities having to do with agricultural subsidies, having to do with manufacturing, manufactured goods and agricultural trade barriers and services, there is going to be a negotiation involving anti-dumping, countervailing duty laws, and presumably whatever is going to happen on zeroing will happen in that context. I would note, and I think it is worth noting, that the Bush administration, and I would say historically the U.S. government, but certainly I can speak for the Bush administration, was really very, very good about making certain that when we were found in contravention of the WTO in a couple of really difficult areas, one being Foreign Sales Corporation, one being something called the Byrd Amendment, that the administration went through, used a lot of political capital with the Congress to change major domestic U.S. laws to come into compliance with our international agreements. And I think that's something that hasn't been recognized, but I can tell you from having worked the Hill on this, changing some of those very, very popular, in one case, U.S. tax laws, in another case, U.S. trade laws, to come into compliance was a huge undertaking, and it was the right thing to do. I mean, again, it goes back to the question of enforcement and credibility, and if we aren't going to come into compliance, then it's hard to expect other countries to do so. The interesting thing about zeroing is when you actually run the numbers, you discover that if the U.S. hadn't used zeroing as part of its calculation over the last couple of years, the difference in dumping margins would be 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points. So it's even, as a commercial matter, it's largely irrelevant. But there's a trade bar meaning the trade lawyers group that I think has a religious commitment to this, and it will sort itself out at some point. Your point about emerging markets and multilateral trade negotiations, I think, is well taken. I was being a little glib. I think one of the things that I appreciated most about my Doha experience was long before you had these discussions in terms of climate change and what will China do and what will India do. China and India, Brazil were at the table as co-equals in negotiations in the Doha round, and I think that was and is a very healthy development that still requires, as I implied in my more formal remarks, some catching up in terms of the approach that these countries take to the negotiations. Are they coming to the table representing national interests or broader self-interests? Are they representing, quote, developing countries? And that was perhaps one of the sources of frustration that I had during the Doha round negotiations, where if you think about it, the vast majority of developing countries, certainly the LDCs, but let's say the 100 poorest developing countries in the world, by and large, have pretty much unlimited access to the U.S. market and the EU market through preference programs, with the exception of some key tariff peaks that will go away if the Doha round ever gets done. Where trade can generate economic growth, it is only with new trade flows, and you don't get new trade flows unless you're actually cutting into applied rates. Well, where is the growth going to come from globally in the next 5 years, 10 years, whatever? Well, it's emerging markets. And even before the current global recession, the IMF was telling us that over 50% of global GDP growth in the next 5 years is going to come from emerging markets. Well, unless and until the emerging markets are opening their markets to each other and to other developing countries, as well as to the developed world, you're not likely to see a whole lot of economic growth coming out of trade negotiations, and certainly not multilateral trade negotiations. And so the question becomes, at what point do the emerging markets differentiate themselves from other developing countries? Obviously, in the Doha round, the developed countries, quote unquote, will have to do significantly more than any of the developing countries or emerging markets. And by one calculation, you're talking about between 50 and 75% of all of the value of trade and certainly tariff savings coming out of the pockets of the developed world. So even in the most extreme scenario, we're not talking about a huge undertaking by the emerging markets. But what you are talking about is what is the appropriate role and responsibility of the most rapidly growing markets in the world in this global context. And I can tell you that China, India, Brazil, Indonesia have not yet come to grips with that in terms of what they are prepared to do, what their appropriate role should be, and why. And that's an interesting, a very, very interesting phenomenon that we globally are dealing with in terms of these negotiations. That was a much longer answer than
we have
you needed. Sorry.
A question here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing with us your insights. My name is Wang Jiangyu. I come from the law faculty here. I do research on WTO law and Chinese foreign trade law and policy. You didn't mention much about the Doha round in your talk. It's always fascinating to read the stories about last year's WTO ministerial, especially the exchange of fire between you and the trade ministers from China, India, Brazil. The 1 year
Mainly
after.
India.
Yeah, 1 year after, I listened to the podcasting. 1 year after, do you have a reassessment of the performance of the U.S. vis-à-vis China, India, and Brazil? So that's my first question. Sorry. Second, in light of your answer to that lady's question, do you support a reclassification of developing countries' status in the WTO because the current special and differential and preferential system in the WTO do not pay attention to the distinctions between different groups of developing countries? Yeah. So
let me answer the second question first by sharing a story with you. I had at one point I was approached by. Let me back up. On a regular basis, including the summer of 2008 in Geneva, we had a constant stream of developing countries coming to the U.S. delegation going, you need to continue putting pressure on the emerging markets to do more in this negotiation, because for most of these countries, what the U.S. was going to do, and the U.S., you have to understand, the U.S. had on the table at that point contributions that arguably constituted half of what was going to come out of the round. I mean, you just in terms of elimination of tariff peaks, in terms of cuts in the elimination of agricultural export subsidies, cuts in trade barriers in agriculture, and so on. So the U.S. had an awful lot, and put a lot on the table, offered a lot on the table. I had this constant stream of developing countries coming and saying, you know, what you're doing, you, the U.S., in terms of eliminating tariff peaks, is preference erosion. You know, if you've got countries that have trade, you know, part of the GSP program or of the Andean Trade Preference Program or AGOA, which is a special program for Africa, every time the U.S. or the EU are cutting tariffs, it is, quote, an erosion of a preference for these developing countries. So what they really were interested in was China getting its barriers down, you know, getting access to the Chinese market, the Indonesian market, some of the really big, emerging, rapidly growing emerging markets. And so my response to them was, well, why don't you speak up? You know, why don't you say something in public? Don't just keep coming to me. I'm taking all this heat for you know, standing in the way of some Doha round deal. And I had one African trade minister say to me, oh, you know, the problem is the elephants are hiding behind the mice. And I thought that was a very telling, it was a very telling comment. And yes, in fact, in the name of, quote, the developing world, major trading countries, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, were saying, well, we have to have all of these flexibilities and all of the, you know, we have all these sensitivities. And in fact, if you look at the tariff lines, in many cases, and certainly in agriculture, in many cases, those flexibilities were going to be used against other developing countries. So that then leads to the answer to your first question, which is, if I had to do it all over again, I think I would have done exactly what I did this summer of 08. I mean, we really, I'll tell you, when we had the conversations at the White House, we really wanted, I mean, the Bush administration really, really wanted a Doha roundtable. I mean, we really wanted, you can't spend, I mean, there's just an emotional component to it. You don't spend the kind of hours and weeks and months and years that we spend in this negotiation and not want to close it on your own watch. So if we could have closed it, we would have closed it. What were the criteria, you know, we were looking at? You know, when you know, how do you judge this behemoth negotiation? And we had three criteria we were looking at. First and foremost, was the deal going to contribute to global economic growth, and in particular in developing countries and the alleviation of poverty? So that was our first criteria. Our second criteria was, so in the first case, would it generate new trade flows and benefit, you know, generate economic growth, particularly in developing countries? Second criteria was, would it benefit the U.S. market in terms of U.S. export interests, or the U.S. economy in terms of U.S. export interests? And the third criteria was, would it contribute to combating protectionist trends in the United States and around the world? So those were sort of the three measures, the three criteria we were looking at as we were negotiating. And unfortunately, what was on the table in July of 2008 did not meet any single one of those criteria. And therefore, even if we could have closed the deal, and quite frankly, there were countries at the table that were absolutely determined to make sure there was no deal for a variety of domestic political reasons. Even if we could have closed the deal, arguably it wouldn't have had the benefits that you should expect from an 8-year multilateral trade negotiation. That's not to say it isn't doable. I think it is doable. But there's a lot more work that needs to go into specifics. One of the frustrations about the Doha round, and I will tell you where I'm coming from. I happen to believe that multilateral trade agreements are so much more significant than bilateral and regional deals. I mean, they're so much more significant for all involved in terms of bang for the economic buck. But the frustration with the Doha round. One, because it's the 8th multilateral round like that, all the easy stuff was done. The only stuff that's left is the hard stuff. It's the tariff piece. It's the things that countries avoided doing since 1947, right? So that's all that's left. So no wonder it's hard to do. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the sort of formulaic approach to negotiations meant that for the first, 4 or 6 years of the negotiation, we were negotiating about negotiations. And it's really hard to build, for any country, the U.S., China, India, it's really hard to build up any enthusiasm among your domestic constituencies when you're arguing about Swiss formulas and coefficients, as opposed to arguing about what is the tariff going to be on soybeans and what is the tariff going to be on widgets and what is the subsidy reduction going to be in cotton, because it's only when you start getting to specifics that you're going to be able to get any kind of interest. I mean, this is a multilateral trade round that has had virtually no private sector engagement, because it's all been at the level of theory rather than the level of specifics. Actually, worse than that, the way the formulas are constructed, because of the flexibility, you've got sort of these formula cuts and then sensitivities. There's a negotiating characteristic whereby you come to the table assuming that the things that you care the most about, getting access internationally, will be taken off the table by virtue of countries using their flexibilities. And the Bush administration trade policy was a very forthcoming, market liberalizing, positive trade policy. I think the Bush administration gets criticized for a lot of things. The trade policy is not one of them. Other than internally within the United States and the Democratic Party. The Obama administration, at least for now, is looking for policies that don't look like they were the last administration's policies. And that's not just true in trade, it's true in foreign policy, it's true in a variety of policies, and that's okay. They have to do what they have to do. They got elected, and I want them to succeed. I'm an American. This is my government too. I want them to succeed. It's my country. In terms of the macro and the micro, obviously your Lee Kuan Yew school education has told you that when we're talking about the massive imbalances that help to generate some of the trade imbalances, the trade policies had very, very little to do with those imbalances. We have, we're in a part of the world where after the Asian financial crisis, a lot of countries decided that they just need to run, they need to be running perpetual and large current account surpluses. We've got really high savings rates here. The United States has appallingly low savings rates. We need to address our side of the economic equation, but it has to do with savings and investment. It has to do with consumption rates rather than trade policies per se.
Whoops, I'm Kristen Paulson. I have a political question for you, Susan. I've been thinking a lot about the current administration and its sort of delay in announcing trade policy, and I agree with you. I think there are a lot of people that really want to move forward with trade policy, but they have a political problem. And, the Clinton administration had some of this too, but the economy was much better then. And there was a lot of business that wanted to move into China in a big way kind of thing. And that probably helped turn that around faster. Do you think that health care is going to be enough to sort of assuage the domestic concerns that would allow this administration to move on to trade, or will they have to do some other really big things, possibly involving the same committee people that also have to deal with trade?
Chris was alluding to the fact that it is the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committees that are the principal committees of jurisdiction when it comes to international trade in the Congress. And that goes back to these are the tax writing committees, and it goes back to the days where tariffs were in fact simply taxes, taxes collected at the border. This is a bad environment, obviously, for trade policy, but then the Democratic leadership in the House refused to move trade agreements that clearly were in the national economic interest of the United States at the height of the boom. So, one, I don't know that the economic environment per se is that much of an issue. We have learned that unless and until a president of the United States, Republican or Democrat, is willing to use political capital, the Congress would prefer not to move trade legislation, trade liberalizing legislation. So it's going to require the exercise, the use of political capital on the part of the administration. That's what the Clinton administration found, and they reached this conclusion and ended up moving NAFTA and the Uruguay round agreements through Congress. I do not believe that if you're asking about organized labor as constituency, I do not believe that there is anything this administration can do that will be enough to convince the AFL-CIO or the United Auto Workers that trade liberalizing agreements are a good idea. And I say that because for 10, 15 years, organized labor and their key elected representatives would say, if you only had enforceable labor and environmental protections in these bilateral free trade agreements, then we'd be able to vote for them. We'd be able to support them. And in 2007, I negotiated a deal with Nancy Pelosi and Charlie Rangel, the Democratic leadership in the House, to take the 4 pending free trade agreements with Colombia, with Panama, with Peru, with South Korea, and to seek a reopening of those to add bilateral obligations on labor rights and the environment. It was a very tough deal to negotiate both with the Congress and with our trading partners. And then lo and behold, after we did exactly what they told us to do, all of a sudden, the labor unions decided, and the key members of Congress who represent them or listen to them religiously, all of a sudden they had other problems with trade. So I don't think that there's anything this administration can do. They have signed into law a new trade adjustment assistance program that probably takes the cost of the program from $1 billion a year to $4 or $5 billion a year, expanded coverage. I think it's a good thing. I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing. They're going to get their health care reform, but for a variety of reasons, organized labor is not going to change its mind about trade policy. The question is, will the administration, and if it does, at what point will the administration decide that the U.S. economic imperative to export overrides this very narrow segment of the U.S. workforce that wants to prevent these agreements? Let's face it, if you look at our current account situation, our budget deficit, nobody expects that the U.S. consumer is going to consume its way out of the current recession. We're going to have to be exporting. 95% of the world's population are outside our borders. I don't need to tell you any of this, but I mean, the point is, it is an economic imperative. And so at what point will the administration say, you know, we got to do this because this is what's going to create jobs. And they got to figure it out on their own time, and figure out how they're going to address their politics. And you know, I'll do anything I can to be helpful, but I'm not their problem.
May I just quickly add to this?
Yeah.
What sort of I'm sort of getting increasingly convinced about, from what I see, that unless U.S. addresses the competitiveness issue, the cost, and obviously convincing labor that U.S. labor is getting high cost, and the rest of the world, whether you like it or not, is able to provide at a lower cost, and everything is not exchange rate. You cannot do, if you just eliminate the exchange rate arbitrage, this competitiveness issue is not going to get resolved. Now, I can understand that the government may not have, it's a difficult thing to tackle politically. Why isn't the academia in the U.S. trying to address this? I mean, that's a one way of starting to build consensus.
This presumes somebody actually listens to academics in the United States. Sorry.
I'm in the same group.
Let me actually quibble a little with one of the things you said on the competitiveness issue. The U.S. is remarkably competitive, and U.S. manufacturing is remarkably competitive, globally competitive. I mean, we are by far the largest manufacturer in the world. $1.7 trillion worth of manufacturing output. We are, the top exporter of manufactured goods in massive number in many sectors, but they're not consumer goods, and they're not quote labor intensive goods. And so part of the political perception problem we have in the United States is the average American goes into a store, and every label they see says made in China or made someplace else, and they think, oh, we don't make anything anymore. Well, the fact of the matter is the things that we make and sell competitively, you're not going to find at Walmart. There are turbines, and there are well, I'm on the board of Caterpillar. I mean, earth-moving equipment, excavators, aircraft. You're still in United Technologies. What? You're not. Well, in any event, you're talking about a major competitive manufacturing base, but productivity enhancements are such that labor, we have had an increase, a steady increase year over year, and obviously this past 18 months is an aberration, but a steady increase in manufacturing output in the United States, and a steady decline in manufacturing employment. And so the question is, what will those individuals be doing? And the Obama administration, and President Obama, in his campaign rhetoric and in what he has said since, is I believe, right on target when he's talking about the importance of education, the importance of health reform. I may or may not like this particular piece of legislation, but the fundamentals in terms of portability of pensions, portability of health care, those are all going to contribute to U.S. competitiveness. But if you happen to be United Auto Workers, this isn't going to help your membership. And what you're focused on is how many card-carrying members of your union are there, and that's where the conflict comes in. It's not how many Americans are working. We all want to see Americans gainfully employed and at healthy wages, but that's the policy.
Thanks. Let me just ask one question, then I have a forward contract on a question here. Thinking about this week in APEC, if there were to be movement on P4 Trans-Pacific or movement on some type of Asian-Pacific free trade agreement, if that movement took place, how might that affect the dynamics of the Doha round?
That is a very, very good question. I am fearful that we won't actually have to worry about that.
That's the first best, but let's take the second.
Let's take the second best. I believe that it's interesting, and I'm going on the basis of empirical evidence rather than theory. It depends on the country and the kind of bilateral regional deals they're negotiating. What I found with U.S. FTA partners, the countries with which we negotiated free trade agreements were in the lead in pursuing an ambitious outcome to the Doha round, even though it meant the erosion of preferential access on a bilateral regional basis. But you sort of think about the countries that are front and center in terms of wanting to see an ambitious outcome. It's Chile, Australia, Singapore. I mean, our trading partners were out there. So in that particular case, even though one could argue the narrow self-interest is against a multilateral deal, in fact, those countries are self-selected and understand that it is trade. The bilateral regional approach is a vehicle to achieve trade liberalization, and they embrace other vehicles to achieve trade liberalization. There are some other countries, unfortunately, including a couple of major emerging markets, that I worry have concluded that negotiating bilateral or regional deals is a terrific way to pursue a trade agenda and avoid doing hard things that come with a multilateral deal. The number of exclusions, the number of tariff lines that are excluded, countries that are that choose each other because neither are competitive in agriculture, so they can just not have to deal with the issue of agricultural market access. I worry that some countries are using the bilateral and regional deals as an excuse or as an alternative to a robust multilateral deal, and I think that is a real danger to the multilateral trading system. It is something I need to worry about. But there's no set answer. I mean, it really has to do with the individual country and their motivation and what their tolerance level is for doing difficult things for a very, very significant gain in the context of multilateral outcome.
We had a question.
Hi, Ambassador. Thanks for being here, and I'm interested in Alpha. You spent a lot of time in rooms with your counterparts. Who do you miss? Why? Who irritated you the most? Why? And you don't have to name names.
I was going to say, I'm not going to do that on the record.
This is on the record?
No, you don't talk about names, and how much does personality play a part in negotiation?
Oh, a lot. It turns out personalities play quite a significant role. Personalities and personal political aspirations. I mean, the trade ministers are sort of an odd lot. First of all, every country is organized differently in terms of who's negotiating trade on their behalf. So in the U.S., you have U.S. Trade Representative's Office. We are part of the Executive Office of the President. The USTR is part of the Cabinet. But we work through these concentric circles involving all these other agencies. In the case of China, you've got a minister who is a minister of Trade and Commerce, but who actually reports to a vice premier. So you've got different level, different ministers with different kinds of portfolios. Some countries come to the table with two negotiators, agriculture and industry. Japan does that as a for example. So so you have a lot of different flavors of trade ministers, and some have more authority than others. I mean, if you sort of think about what is negotiated today in a trade agreement, very little of it is actually under the control of the trade minister. And so what most trade ministers are having to do is to go back constantly and sort of work with the agriculture ministry and work with the commerce ministry and work with whoever is responsible for intellectual property and so on, and bring these together. You spend so much, certainly in the context of the Doha round, you spend between Doha round negotiations and APEC meetings twice a year, G8 meetings, all of these different gatherings, Cairns group. There are a lot of different affinity groups in the trade area. You spend a lot of time with your counterparts. And even though in many cases you're on opposite sides of the table, you are, if you're good, and if you are a responsible negotiator, really what you're doing is you're coming to the table with a shared problem-solving exercise. And you try to understand what the needs and sensitivities are of the person on the other side of the table, or in the case of a multilateral deal, your multiple trading partners. You try to appreciate where they're coming from. You try to make sure they understand where you're coming from. You try to build up enough trust so that you can actually try out different combinations and permutations of the deal to see whether there's some Pareto optimal outcome that you can deliver. And you build up a real set of personal relationships. My Indian counterpart and I had our differences in terms of what outcome we wanted in Doha, but I consider him a friend. I had dinner with him a month ago. He's in a new job. I'm in a new job. I'm sorry the Doha round didn't come together, but you build up personal relationships and ideally a degree of trust and respect, and mutual respect. That when the political environment is right, you can use to deliver a positive outcome. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Well, one quick comment first. I agree with what you said about the Bush administration's overall trade policies. However, the problem is I don't think you got sufficient credit for it in the general perception. But secondly, and more importantly, I think, the question is the conventional wisdom, which I think I subscribe to, and which I think from your comments you may also, is that this economic crisis may be a seminal stage in the United States economic development. And as you say, the jobs that were lost, people are not going to go back to those same jobs in very many cases. So my question is, how do you see the next phase of our evolution economically going?
Wow. It's hard to know where to start. Obviously, being more conscious about knowledge-intensive industry, knowledge-intensive jobs. But I also think more of an emphasis on exporting. And that in and of itself raises some questions. There are major developed and developing countries that have for so long focused on export-led growth. And this assumption that the U.S. consumer would always be there to pull everybody out of whatever global recession we happen to encounter. And I think we're not there anymore. And I think that's something you're hearing from the Obama administration. They're just not what is the alternative and how does it play out? And this whole conversation about imbalances really, it's a euphemism for a whole lot of things, including the value of the RMB, right? Or the value of the dollar, let's say. And by the way, I should note, when you are the U.S. Trade Representative, one of the things you never talk about is ever. And it's sort of liberating. You don't have to speculate when you don't know and no one else knows. But I think it's going to, like most economists, it's going to take a while for jobs to come back. I do think that our, call it more Darwinian approach to the economy does generally bring with it a faster recovery than the one being predicted right now. But we've got a pretty resilient, economy. In this particular case, though, it is critical that we don't see a closing down of international commerce, because I think that's going to be a component part of it, and where, today, 12% of our GDP is associated with trade. My guess is that number will go up. But we'll see. I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend to answer your question. It's a great question.
Thank you. We have one question at the front, and then I'm afraid that Susan wants to.
No,
yeah.
My name is Kema. I'm on 20 School of Public Policy and BBCNS. And I just wanted to know, you mentioned that if the U.S. does not lead in pro-trade liberalization, then nobody will lead. So, and at presently, U.S. imbalances, there are a lot of voices of U.S. will no longer be optional last resort. Then, do you see any possibility or any country with a potential or capacity in the current conflict?
That is absolutely the right question, and the answer right now is no. I mean, I don't see China stepping up to lead. I don't see India stepping up to lead. I don't see Indonesia stepping up to lead. I don't see the U.S. stepping up to lead. And the Europeans talk about it, but they don't. They've been talking about it for years, but for some reason they just have a really hard time delivering. And they don't tend to step up either. So the answer is no, and it's one of the things I worry about. Stepping up to lead means both leading by example, and when you lead by example, being able to convince others that this is the way to go. It doesn't have to be a solo act, and I think that really is the distinction. You don't have to have, and you may never have the United States by itself doing this. It is the United States in concert with other countries that have the capacity and should be stepping up. And at what point do they recognize it is in their national self-interest to contribute to a global self-interest? And we're not quite there yet.
Look, thank you very much. I'm not sure if that's an entirely pessimistic note, but I think it lays down a challenge for the region in terms of this leadership role. And I think with economic growth, with economic strength and power comes responsibility. And I think this is a message that's important for the region. So look, thank you very much.